Breaking news out of Lebanon, where a massive explosion has hit the capital of Beirut, injuring people and causing widespread damage across the city.
Anger grows at the government after Tuesday's catastrophic explosion in Beirut.
U.S. economic growth shrank 32.9% in the second quarter. That is by far the largest quarterly drop since record-keeping began.
Thousands of people have taken to the streets of the Lebanese capital Beirut in anger at the country's leaders after this week's devastating explosion in the port area of the city. Some protesters have stormed the foreign ministry building, declaring it the seat of the revolution. Tuesday's blast was caused when a huge stock of ammonium nitrate blew up, killing at least 158 people and leaving more than 300,000 homeless.
Lebanon's prime minister and entire cabinet have resigned in the wake of last week's deadly explosion in Beirut.
21 million confirmed coronavirus cases around the world, and that figure is rising by more than 250,000 new cases every day.
That is Tropical Storm Laura. There's a lot of warm water just south of Cuba and then especially out in the Gulf of Mexico, and so the National Hurricane Center makes this a Category 2 storm.
Jacob Blake walking around his car, followed by at least 2 officers, and then as the door to the driver's side opens and he starts to get in the car, that is when the officer behind him opens fire 7 times in a row from point-blank range.
It's headed towards the Texas coast and the Louisiana coast, somewhere right around that area, and it's likely to come ashore tomorrow night into early on Thursday morning, and it could be a devastating storm.
California is used to wildfires, but nothing like this. The scale is unparalleled. An area 5 times the size of New York is currently burning.
It's stronger. Winds are now 125 miles an hour. Once it gets to 130 miles an hour, it becomes a Cat 4. This is likely to be the strongest storm you have ever experienced.
Protests in Kenosha turning violent for a 3rd straight night. Here's more of that terrifying video.
Three people have been shot, 2 of them fatally during a 3rd night of protest over Sunday's police shooting of Jacob Blake. Wisconsin's governor has now declared a state of emergency.
When was the last time you remember the National Weather Service using the word unsurvivable to describe a storm surge?
And this is likely to be the strongest storm to ever hit Louisiana.
This now joins an elite group. It's in the top 10. A small elite group of the most dangerous hurricanes to ever make landfall into the U.S. Most likely, Cameron's elevation, we were figuring out, it's probably like 5 to 10 feet at the most. It's underwater. There is no doubt about it.
Let's take a look at some of the storm that's happening right now. This is obviously Hurricane Laura, and here's the aftermath. This is in Texas. This is Crystal Beach, Texas. You're going to begin with the rising death toll and utter devastation caused by Hurricane Laura.
Laura made landfall near Cameron, Louisiana, blasting the small town with 150-mile-per-hour winds.
Entire towns underwater. Along the coast, the destruction goes on for miles.
Homes and businesses that weren't destroyed by the wind were flooded by the storm surge.
America in the run-up to the 2020 election, a deeply divided country that often seems to be tearing itself apart.
This year, experts predict that upwards of 156 million Americans will cast a ballot in the presidential election. That's a huge number. And some 80 million of those will be cast by mail. This is unprecedented.
As you see there, police fired pepper spray and tear gas toward a large group of demonstrators. 11 people were arrested and 3 officers were injured. 43 million Americans are baking under record temperatures. California, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado are all in the middle of a historic heat wave that won't break until midweek.
Will subject you to arrest, citation, or crowd controlations, including but not limited to tear gas and/or weapons. Leave the area immediately.
California, where dozens of wildfires are now raging out of control in what's being described as an unprecedented disaster. 39 million Americans are under red flag warnings as we come on the air tonight, and there's growing fear that scorching temperatures and high winds will only make the situation worse in the coming days.
2 million acres have burned in California alone just this year.
Tonight, the Creek Fire is being called an unprecedented disaster, spiraling flames in all directions.
Firefighters are battling
battling dozens of massive wildfires across several states. In California, for example, the fires there have already caused a nearly 2,000% increase in the amount of acres burned year to date over this time last year. The state is seeing 3 of the 4 largest fires in its history.
The deadly firestorm is now spewing so much toxic ash into the skies, the smoke trails from the blazes are visible from space.
Tonight, hundreds of thousands of people up and down the West Coast are trapped in what feels like a dystopia within the dystopia that is 2020. Amid a year that's already been so brutal with a once-in-a-century pandemic, the sky in parts of California and Oregon turned apocalyptic orange this week. The smoke from wildfires blocked out the sun.
The toxic smoke and ash spewing from the growing blazes has made the air quality in Portland and San Francisco the worst in the world.
In Oregon, 500,000 are under evacuation orders, more than 12% of the state's population. And in California, this fire north of Sacramento is now the largest in state history. Never in the American West has so much burned so quickly. 6 of the biggest wildfires in California history have broken out this year.
Smoke from dozens of major fires has drifted all the way across the country and is casting a haze in New York City. New evacuation orders are in place in Oregon because weather conditions could make things worse.
U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died at the age of 87.
Protests have erupted nationwide after no police officers were charged directly with the death of Breonna Taylor.
I think the future is unwritten, and anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen is wrong. We're in utterly uncharted territory.
Smoke now reaching all the way to Europe.
Tonight, the United States has reached yet another devastating and unthinkable moment in a pandemic that continues to change our country and our way of life. As we come on the air tonight, more than 200,000 people in the U.S. have now been killed by the virus.
The Senate battle over Justice Ginsburg's vacant seat is shaping up to be absolutely brutal. Republican leaders say they're ready to move forward with the confirmation by Election Day. Democrats say voters should decide who chooses the new justice.
2 police officers in Louisville, Kentucky have been shot tonight amid protests over Breonna Taylor's death. Hundreds of people filled the streets in San Diego, Chicago, Colorado, and Atlanta.
Battle lines being drawn on Capitol Hill over President Trump's new Supreme Court nominee as well. Republicans are pushing for a swift confirmation for Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Joe Biden calls the GOP's election season effort an abuse of power. Today, the president again praised his conservative pick as Democrats make clear they want the president and Republicans who back him to pay the price for it at the polls.
They're going to try and steal the election. Look at this crowd. The only way they can win is to cheat on the ballot.
Protesters are vowing to stay on the streets of Louisville, Kentucky for a 4th day. People demonstrated after no police officers were directly charged with the killing of Breonna Taylor.
California's wildfire season keeps getting worse. 3 more people have died. That's 29 since last month. The collective burn area is nearly the size of 3 million football fields.
President Trump just tweeted moments ago that he and the First Lady have tested positive for the coronavirus.
The president is expected to depart the White House soon to go up to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center.
The president of the United States is now being aggressively treated for a deadly virus, just 31 days before the election, as the number of people around him who are now infected continues to grow.
At this time, the team and I are extremely happy with the progress the president has made. Thursday, he had a mild cough and some nasal congestion and fatigue, all of which are now resolving and improving.
Now to that monster storm threatening millions along the Gulf Coast. Hurricane Delta exploded into a major Category 4 hurricane overnight.
The team and I agree that all our evaluations, and most importantly, his clinical status, support the president's safe return home.
So it's about to emerge back over the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, it's doing that right now. And as it does so, it's going to run right into really hot waters once again. And that's why we think it's going to re-strengthen. This storm could hit 15 miles from where Hurricane Laura hit as a Cat 4.
Hurricane Delta is slamming into the Louisiana Gulf Coast tonight. As we come on the air, more than 11 million Americans are in Delta's path. There are mandatory evacuation orders across Louisiana.
This, by the way, is the 10th storm to make landfall in 2020, and that sets a new record in the Atlantic Ocean.
More than 700,000 people are without power along the U.S. Gulf Coast after Hurricane Delta made landfall on Friday. Heavy rain and powerful winds
winds pummeled the region, tearing down trees and power lines and flooding streets along the coast. The dangerous storm packed winds of up to 100 miles per hour.
New restrictions and growing anger, all doing a number on hard-working people, trying to figure out how not to wind up at a food bank or in a hospital. The ugly truth is that this second wave of COVID-19 cases is hitting Europe like a tsunami. Take a look at these numbers. Leaders frantic, trying to get a grip on the intensifying crisis that you see reflected here. In Germany, nearly every major city in the country is now a virus hotspot. Stuttgart asking the military for help fighting the pandemic.
Hospital intensive care units in Paris are filling up again. COVID has come raging back.
Voters across at least 3 states said they received threatening emails from an account posing as the right-wing group Proud Boys. Now, the emails had a chilling message: vote Trump or else.
We have already seen Iran sending spoofed emails designed to intimidate voters, incite social unrest.
Iran and Russia got their hands on voter information.
Hurricane force winds have prompted urgent red flag fire warnings tonight in Southern California, where a new wildfire has forced tens of thousands from their homes.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Good evening, everyone. We're coming on the air with breaking news. The Senate has just voted to confirm President Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to succeed Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. The Senate voted 52 to 48, one of the closest and most partisan votes for a Supreme Court confirmation in American history.
Now to some new reporting on an increasingly frequent image on America's streets. Heavily armed groups calling themselves militias.
Self-described militias are becoming a regular sight on the streets of many American cities.
Are we talking Civil War? Because people say Civil War in these groups all the time.
I think that's a possibility.
Here's the very latest on the unrest in Philadelphia. A citywide curfew will go into effect at 9 o'clock tonight and will remain in effect until tomorrow at 6. Officials hope that it will prevent a repeat of last night, where looters ravaged stores in Port Richmond, helping themselves to merchandise and then leaving behind a lot of damage. In West Philadelphia, protesters and police clashed. At least 23 officers were injured.
Enjoying the last few hours of freedom with friends, Parisians watched their president deliver the bad news.
Je compte sur chacun d'entre vous.
Emmanuel Macron told the country a new lockdown had to be a brutal break on rocketing COVID infections. As of midnight tonight, bars, restaurants, and non-essential businesses will close until December. Those schools and factories will stay open. But police will check that anyone out on the street has a good reason to leave home.
Don't expect to turn on the TV and see a declared winner on election night.
Here's a sobering number. The U.S. added coronavirus cases faster than 1 per second on Thursday. And today, the nation passed 9 million cases and is now approaching 230,000 deaths.
The number of Hawaii residents who have already voted this year is more than the total number of Hawaii residents who have voted in any previous election since Hawaii became a state.
Pandemic or not, Americans are turning out to vote early and doing so in record numbers. As of today, more than 90 million ballots have been cast, and that number will increase. That 90 million is more than 65% of the total votes cast by everyone in 2016.
Today, new steel fencing went up around the White House complex. Security is being tightened all over the country over concerns about unrest after the election.
It has been another extraordinary election. One of our first battleground states turns blue, New Hampshire, and then a huge sigh of relief at Republican HQ as Texas goes red. It is now 1:30, and Minnesota, it's gone blue much more heavily tonight. Was that the George Floyd story up there in Minnesota? Was that what swayed the Democrats and persuaded them to come out?
We still do not know the results from the presidential election, as many states remain too close to call.
If you managed to sleep last night, things change. You may have gone to bed thinking this election was headed one way, and then you woke up and you saw things were different.
Dramatic and potentially decisive. The president cannot win without Pennsylvania and without Georgia. Overnight, Georgia flipped blue. Seconds ago, Pennsylvania.
This is a fraud on the American public.
We don't have a final declaration of victory yet, but the numbers tell us it's clear. We're going to win this race.
While all of us have been focused on the presidential election, the pandemic situation is getting dire, and more dire. This chart is just depressing. You see the first peak in April, the summer surge, Yesterday, another record.
The President-elect of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
Despite his refusal to admit it, President Trump's time in the White House is coming to an end.
China, it seems, tightening its grip on Hong Kong. Authorities expelled 4 lawmakers from the Legislative Council earlier. In response, the pro-democracy opposition resigned en masse.
Hong Kong's parliament will, in effect, cease to have any opposition.
Tonight, the nation's largest school system, New York City, says it's closing all of its schools, sending more than 250,000 students who had been in classrooms back home for virtual learning tomorrow morning.
Pfizer is now the first company to apply for emergency authorization of its COVID-19 vaccine, setting off a sprint by scientists at the FDA to approve it. Tonight, Iran is vowing revenge and accusing Israel of playing a role in an ambush that left a prominent scientist dead. The mastermind behind Iran's nuclear program was gunned down in an apparent assassination today. No one is claiming responsibility.
President Hassan Rouhani blamed Israel for the killing. Israel has stayed silent.
The killing threatens to renew tensions between the U.S. and Iran.
The coronavirus is not taking the holidays off, and health experts fear people gathering to celebrate will make a bad situation even worse. The nation hit another record Friday with more than 205,000 new infections. The U.S. leads the world with more than 13 million infections.
Tell me the law that I have broken by being here today.
The law he's broken is that protesters can't meet in groups of more than 2 under current emergency coronavirus legislation. The images of people being arrested for protesting won't sit well with the dozens of Tory backbenchers preparing to rebel against the government's post-lockdown tier system, which sees tighter rules than before lockdown.
Well, this group of people clearly don't believe in the science. They don't believe in the lockdown.
Clashes have broken out in Paris as tens of thousands of people march through the city in protest against a new law which restricts the right to publish images of the police.
Been the worst month yet for the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. A record number of new cases and worries that Thanksgiving travel will turn out to have been a super spreader event.
In the 2 days since Thanksgiving, there have been 346,000 new confirmed COVID cases and 2,700 deaths.
Words the whole world has been waiting to hear, spoken just moments ago to CNN. It is the start of the end of the pandemic.
But the process now is going to go very quickly. Shipments are going to be going to the UK within a matter of days. Then people will get jabs in their arms probably at the beginning of next week. This could be the beginning of the end of the coronavirus pandemic.
People in different parts of the UK will start to be given their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine. Those over 80, care home staff and frontline NHS workers will be prioritised.
While the nation sees the death toll and the number of coronavirus cases rise, President Trump remains focused on other things, including overturning the certified presidential election.
An FDA advisory panel has voted in favor of authorizing Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine for emergency use. All of this comes as the U.S. records another day of historic deaths. The total number of cases is now above 15.5 million. That's more than 4% of the entire U.S. population.
New restrictions announced in the last hour for the entire state of Pennsylvania.
There's breaking news tonight from the Supreme Court. In a 7-2 ruling, the justices refused to hear a lawsuit filed by the Texas Attorney General trying to throw out millions of ballots in 4 states, all but now ending the president's attempt to reverse his election loss.
Ayes 55, noes 0.
The moment Joe Biden formally became this country's president-elect.
Joe Biden has been formally certified as the next president of the United States.
Some U.S. government agencies and corporations were hacked in a large-scale cyber attack. It appears to be the work of a foreign enemy. Now, security experts are scrambling to assess the damage.
CBS News has learned the breach is so large, investigators aren't sure yet how many government agencies may have been compromised. Preliminary evidence points to Vladimir Putin's government as being behind the attack.
This is nothing short of a virtual invasion by the Russians into critical accounts of our federal government. We need to make it clear to Mr. Putin, to China, to Iran, and to any nation that would compromise and breach our security that there is a price to pay. No, I'm not calling for an invasion myself or all-out war. I don't want to see that happen.
Hospitals across the southeast of England have begun cancelling non-urgent operations, with some struggling to cope with double the number of COVID patients they had in the spring. It comes as government sources confirmed tonight that there is concern about the new variant of COVID-19, amid fears it could be making the virus more infectious and harder to contain.
Officials now believe hackers targeted at least a half dozen government agencies, including the Department of Energy that oversees our nuclear weapons stockpile.
We're going to have to do the forensics. This could probably take some time before we really determine the true damage. But if we do and we find out for sure who's done this, there have to be sanctions. There has to be a pushback. There has to be punishment. There have to be consequences.
California remains the epicenter of America's COVID surge. The state now has more cases than Italy.
President Trump sending a warning to Iran after a series of rocket attacks targeted the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad.
Some friendly health advice to Iran. If one American is killed, I will hold Iran responsible. Think it over.
Scenes of utter destruction after an explosion this morning in downtown Nashville. Investigators believe it was an intentional act. Tonight, they are asking for the public's help in identifying who was behind it in order to bring them to justice. Take a look. Nearly 24 buildings along that entire city block are damaged.
Investigators are now combing the crime scene, looking for clues, starting with the identification of that RV.
New and more contagious strain of COVID-19 has spread to more than a dozen countries, and many health experts believe it is already here in the States. The U.S. has reached more than 19.1 million coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. More than 333,000 people have died.
As far as a motive goes, authorities say they are still looking into that, but they are considering the possibility that Warner may have been targeting the communications infrastructure.
This RV was parked outside an AT&T transmission building in downtown Nashville when it exploded, knocking out cell and Wi-Fi service from Tennessee to Alabama.
The Nashville bombing is prompting new concerns tonight about so-called lone wolf terror threats here in the U.S.
British regulators have authorized a second coronavirus vaccine as a surge in infections threatens to swamp hospitals in the country. AstraZeneca's shot will begin rolling out in the country starting January 4th.
California's governor says the mutation of the virus has been found in Southern California. It is much easier to catch. On Tuesday, the U.S. reported more than 3,700 Americans were killed by the virus, the most in one day since the pandemic began.
New Year's Eve is often a time of reflection, and when we think of 2020, it is going to be remembered for bringing us a pandemic unlike anything we've experienced in our lifetimes before.
2020 will be a year we'll remember for the profound ways it has forever changed our country, from a global pandemic to protests for racial justice, ending with a historic presidential election.
And this is one year I'd like to forget.